Hello. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name's Rachel South, and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House. And I'm so pleased to welcome Dan Healey and Polly Jones for tonight's talk about the Gulag Doctors, which has been shortlisted for the Pushkin House Book Prize 2024. I'm just going to say a couple of words about Dan and Polly, and then we can get started. Dan Healey is Professor of Modern Russian History at St Antony's College, the University of Oxford. His research focuses on the history of gender and sexualities in Russia and the Soviet republics, medicine and psychiatry, and the Gulag. He's written extensively about these topics, and his books include the first full-length study of LGBTQ Russian history, Homosexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia. His other books include Bolshevik Sexual Forensics, Diagnosing Disorder in the Clinic and the Courtroom, and he also co-edited Soviet Medicine, Culture, Practice, Science. The Gulag Doctors is his latest book. Polly Jones is Professor of Russian and Schrecker Barber Fellow at University College, Oxford, and Deputy Chair of the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. She is the author and editor of several books on Soviet cultural history and politics, and her next book, Gulag Fiction, Labour Camp Literature from Stalin to Putin, will be published later this year. She regularly talks on radio and TV about Russian culture and history, and she was also consultant at Armando Iannucci's film, The Death of Stalin. So thank you everyone again for coming. She's also a Pushkin House trustee. How could I forget? So yeah, thank you for coming, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a real pleasure to be here with my colleague and great friend, Dan, and to discuss this really tremendous book. I don't know how many of you have read the book already. I'm sure it will emerge in the Q&A. We assume no prior knowledge, but for those of you who have, and indeed those of you who haven't, you'll know this is a really wonderful, human, vivid book, absolutely beautifully written, and really unearths, as does all Dan's work actually, hidden histories of the Soviet Union that one would never have imagined. It's really a revelation, both to those who know lots about Soviet history and those for whom it's not such a common pursuit. So thank you for the chance to read this book, which I also read in manuscript, and congratulations on the nomination. So Dan and I are going to discuss the book, and then there'll be plenty of chance at the end for Q&A. So Dan, just listening to the summary of your publications in Rachel's introduction, it struck me that once you get to the end of a book and a book comes out, perhaps you see the reasons that drew you to the topic in the first place more clearly in retrospect than perhaps at the time. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to the topic of looking at Gulag medicine, how far back in your sort of career in Soviet history you think the roots of this project stretch.
Thank you very much, Polly, and thank you, Pushkin House, for the opportunity to talk about this new project, this new book. Well, we have to go back to 1974, when I was a high school student in a small town in Ontario, hello Brockville, and my history teacher organized a trip for students to the Soviet Union in 1974, and we went to Leningrad and Moscow, and this was just a month after Solzhenitsyn had been expelled from the Soviet Union as a result of publishing the first volume of Gulag Archipelago in the West. And so Solzhenitsyn's name was everywhere in the press before we left for the Soviet Union. And we asked the in-tourist guides about the Soviet Union, about Solzhenitsyn, about the Gulag Archipelago, and they were very frosty with us and really denounced Solzhenitsyn as a traitor to the Soviet system, as someone who'd taken advantage of the Soviet system by being feted as a Soviet writer, and then who'd thrown it all back in their faces with this terrible calumny, this book. So of course when I went home I thought I really wanted to read this book. Anything that bad must be good. And it launched me on a career in Soviet history, I think. It certainly cemented my interest in Russia and Russian language and Soviet studies more generally. So I take it all the way back to that. But the other thing was, my earlier career was in the LGBTQ history of Russia and the Soviet Union, the other Soviet republics. And the way to do that history, at least 30 years ago when I started, was to look at medicine and law and look at the ways that sexuality was regulated and treated by doctors and psychiatrists and other specialists. And so looking at the confluence between medicine and law became a way that I ultimately found my way to the Gulag and medicine in the Gulag, actually. I'd learned about those contexts enough in previous projects to begin to think, well, I wonder what medicine was like in the Gulag.
Great. So we'll come on to sort of thinking about what indeed medicine was, in what roles it played in the Gulag and what was kind of specific about it. But just your mentioning of Solzhenitsyn is fascinating, actually. I was expecting that the path might be more through your sort of first book about the history of homosexuality and then the sort of growing interest in forensic medicine. So it's really interesting, actually, that it all came back to Solzhenitsyn, because it did for me too. It's this sort of towering figure, and my experience recently of writing this book about Gulag fiction is in a sense of Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov are everywhere, and in a sense, you have to sort of deal with them before one can look at anything else, really. And actually, throughout the book, you talk about both Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, but particularly Solzhenitsyn as a kind of narrative of Gulag medicine that you want to complicate and that is there to be sort of contended with, as it were. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think it sounds from reading the book as though a lot of what you wanted to do was to kind of complicate the story that Solzhenitsyn in particular told about Gulag medicine. We'll come on to Shalamov because his story was more complicated with regard to this. But
well, the problem, it's not a problem. The fact of the matter is, in Gulag studies, Solzhenitsyn laid down the foundations, didn't he? He organized how we actually think about the Gulag. And if you look at the 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago as it is in English, you see a particular organization, a particular approach to the various stages of an arrestee's path through the NKVD systems to the labor camps and then beyond the labor camps, out of the labor camps. That is very much laid down in Solzhenitsyn's work. And it's encyclopedic. It's over 1,500 pages in the English translation. And that proved to be a challenge to teach when I started to teach Gulag history in Swansea University back in the early 2000s. But it also proved to be very challenging to think about medicine through the lens of Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn more or less dismisses medicine in the Gulag camps as ineffective, as lacking in humanity, and also as so bound up with the labor camp system, with what I call sovereign power, with the power of the commandant in the camps, that it could not exercise any clinical judgment, it could not do any good at all. And what I found when I was looking at the archives of Gulag camps and the memoirs of Gulag Doctors was, well, not quite that story, in fact. And so the story I end up telling is one that deviates from the standard narrative that Solzhenitsyn laid down. I mean, when I say Solzhenitsyn is encyclopedic about virtually everything in life in the Gulag camps, the one thing that he doesn't devote a chapter to is the medical sections of the camps. He could have done that very easily. Many, many memoirists wrote about these medical establishments, clinics, hospitals, local stations in local camps and so on. and yet he chose not to, and he chose, in fact, to polemicize with Shalamov in the passages where he does talk about the Gulag, does talk about the Gulag medical system.
Yes, I mean, before we move on to what you actually are, what you actually do in the book, I am curious as well as to how much you were influenced by what Varlam Shalamov has to say about his work in Gulag medicine, because he was involved not just obviously as a patient in the Gulag, but also as somebody who worked in the hospital and who actually in many ways saw that as one of the reasons that he survived the Gulag was because he was engaged in that hospital work, which was less physically demanding, obviously, than other types of labor in the camps. But again, Shalamov is a figure who kind of comes in and out of the book. How would you sort of, how were you positioning yourself against what he was, or in dialogue with what he said about the camps?
He's very important to me in the sense that he does offer a kind of counterpoint to Solzhenitsyn, and so you have to, and because he actually was a Gulag inmate for, I think, 14 years, you have to take what he says seriously. He worked in the Gulag medical system. He knew some of the people who figure largely in my book, some of the doctors and some of the other medical workers whom I talk about at great length in the book. And so Shalamov is important to me in that sense. He takes Gulag medicine seriously as something that simply is not, it's not dismissible. And so that was an important starting point for me. I think probably you would have liked it if I'd spent more time analyzing the specific medical stories that are found in Kolyma tales, for example, in Shalamov's long cycle of short stories about the Gulag, documentary fiction. I didn't do very much of that, although I do focus on it a little bit when I'm talking about malingering and fakers of illness in the chapter on psychiatry in the Gulag. But what I found really fascinating in Shalamov's writing was actually his memoirs, in fact, which are very fragmented, very difficult to, very impressionistic, very angry and full of fluid emotion, which I really quite appreciated, actually. But they gave a different window on Gulag medicine and on the clinics where he worked, on the people who he worked with, on the conditions that he saw and so forth. And I think his reminiscences, Vospominania, are really one of the most important sources for me from Shalamov's canon.
Great. Thank you. So having got Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov out of the way, as we always must when we're talking about the Gulag, thinking about how the project sort of evolved. So having decided that Gulag medicine was, as you often describe it in the book, a puzzle that you kind of wanted to solve and that throws up so many interesting ethical and human questions, can you talk a little bit about how you kind of honed in on the approach that you take here, which is to look at a number of individual lives very richly and different types of what you call Gulag doctors. So how the project evolved from perhaps your initial work in more institutional or central sort of Moscow archives and so on, and where the project ended up research-wise.
So this project started as the archives of the Gulag were being opened up in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And we became aware of this vast body of archival material, documents of the official Gulag administration. And this is, if you like, the opposite side, the mirror side to the Shalamov and Solzhenitsyn perspective on the Gulag. As inmates who lived in the Gulag, they didn't understand the rationales behind the decisions that commandants were making, that work assignment officers and other kinds of officials in the Gulag camps, they had no understanding of the rationales behind it. So now we were learning those rationales in the early 2000s. And I thought, well, we need an institutional history of the Gulag medical system first in order to understand. I was thinking like a conventional historian. And then along came two, while I was dallying with my teaching and administration and the other things that lecturers have to do in life. Two other excellent books were published, one by Boris Nakhapietov in Russian, which is a study of the Gulag health service from these records, and another is by an American historian, Golfo Alexopoulos, called Illness and Inhumanity, which makes a set of arguments about the nature of labor and forced labor in the camps that I don't always agree with, but I appreciate the work that she did in terms of opening up this field and laying out some of the great problems that exist in that particular body of evidence, the Central Moscow Gulag Administrative Archive. So when I actually began the research fieldwork for this project, I went to Gulag cities and I just simply hoovered up a lot of information about doctors in the localities. And when I got home, I realized...
Sorry, Dan, could you just say some of the particular locations where you did the work, because that
yes,
might be helpful.
Yes, no, indeed. I went to Magadan, which is the capital of the Dalstroy gold mining region of Kolyma, where Shalamov was a prisoner. I went to Ukhta and Pechora in the Komi Republic. So that's northern European Russia, this side of the Ural Mountains, but a region largely taken over by the NKVD and the Gulag and opened up by it in the 1930s and 40s. So those were the principal places I went to do research that were towns that had been established by the Gulag. In those towns, I found that the local history museum, the Krayevechsky Muzey, in other words, and also in Ukhta, there was a museum of the history of medicine of the city of Ukhta. And inasmuch as Ukhta was completely founded by the Gulag, it was a history of Gulag medicine under one roof. And so when I discovered that, I phoned them from England and said, I want to come and see what you have. And they were very welcoming. It was a project of retired doctors and medical workers, very enthusiastic, and with the help of local members of the local branch of Memorial. So it was a very rich sort of alternative to the central archives of the Gulag administration that I tapped through those kinds of local historical museums, and they became very important to me. And ultimately, when I was designing this book, to get back to the original question, I realized that, well, I don't need to tell the institutional history of the Gulag, except in the introduction. You can read all about it. But what is fascinating in the materials I have is actually the lives of these doctors, nurses, paramedics, and other medical staff, both prisoner and freely hired medical staff who worked for the Gulag in the Stalin years, and how their careers were either launched or interrupted by arrest and by being forced to work in the medical service in the Gulag camps. So those life trajectories became this sort of real source of fascination for me, and I decided, rather than write a strictly chronological or conventional historical narrative of this institution, I would follow the people and follow the life stories of these people. And I think that was inspiring, in fact.
Yeah, and it's one of the, I mean, it's a tremendous, each of the chapters has usually two particular lives that you concentrate on and different sorts of involvement with the Gulag medical system. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about when we look at this category of Gulag doctors, I don't know what people's preconceptions might be, but we might have this as a sort of singular identity. And one of the things the book brings out is just how different that figure of broadly somebody working in medicine in the Gulag could be, ranging from, as you say, free doctors, who might be our most kind of conventional image, through to a variety of other people involved in Gulag healthcare. Could you talk a little bit about sort of how the system was set up and how people would find their ways into medicine in the Gulag?
So the Gulag always needed some forms of medical services from the outset, and this really started with Solovki in the 1920s, the sort of what would you call it, the kind of laboratory of the Gulag that the secret police set up on remote islands in the north of European Russia in the White Sea in the 1920s. And there were medical facilities, there were clinics and doctors, mostly prisoner doctors working under commandants or medical bureaucrats who were part of the medical service that was internal to the secret police. So one of the peculiarities of Soviet medicine was that alongside a system for civilians, there were embedded medical services that served particularly valuable institutions of the state. And so there was a special medical service for the railways, for example, special medical service for the secret police, for the Kremlin, of course, for the military, of course, had its own medical service as well. And these were quite siloed, quite privileged, and had larger budgets than the civilian medical service. So that's perhaps the backdrop to the Gulag opening up in the late 1920s and early 1930s and becoming a much larger institution, drawing on doctors from these embedded services in particular. Some of the main medical bureaucrats running the entire medical service of the Gulag came out of the railway embedded medical service, for example. But what you had in terms of the kinds of people who populate my book are a mixture of prisoners who are arrested, usually on political grounds, faked political crimes of one kind or another, anti-Soviet agitation, the infamous Article 58, and they are shipped off to the Gulag. It is discovered that they are a doctor or a paramedic or a nurse, and they're handed a kit bag, and they're said, right, okay, on this transport, you are the doctor, you are the nurse, you are the physician who's responsible for keeping people alive. And those people effectively ended up finding that their forced labor in the Gulag camps was actually medical labor. They were quite often not sent to work in general work in the mines or forests, felling timber, or in factories or construction work, which was the typical work that the vast majority of Gulag prisoners did. And instead, their forced labor was work in a clinic or in a hospital or in a medical station in an outlying subdivision of a camp. And they might remain in that work for the entire time of their sentence. And then after their sentence be tied to that work for several years afterwards by the sort of processes of exile that existed in order to tie settlers to the regions that the Gulag colonized. So about 40% of the medical staff in the Gulag, there were about 10,000 workers in 1939 in the medical services in the Gulag. About 40% of those were prisoners. And then the rest were ex-prisoners, or else they were freely hired doctors. I sometimes call them contract doctors because they signed contracts with the Gulag. And a large proportion of those were young women. Because one of the things that happened during the 1930s was that Stalin promoted more women into medical education, and they began to dominate the new cohorts of doctors coming up in the system. And from 1938 onwards, the health commissariat, the medical schools, and the state more generally organized a kind of job assignment system where the Gulag was able to source the medical staff it needed from medical education institutions upon graduation. So there was a graduate job assignment fair, effectively, when you finished your education and you had to go to the job that you were assigned.
Is this a good place to bring in our protagonist, who we've chosen to read an extract from, whose biography aligns with some of what Dan was just discussing, a young woman who features in, I can't remember which chapter it is now, Dan, is it? Anyway, but one of the chapters. Dan's going to read the opening couple of pages about our protagonist, Guzikova. Yes.
Yeah, Guzikova. So the chapter is called I Chose Kolyma, from the medical school benches to the hospitals of the Gulag. Sofia Lazarevna Guzikova graduated as a physician from Moscow Medical Institute in the winter of 1940. She was 23 years old. Much later, probably in the 1980s, she recalled how she became a freely hired Gulag doctor, and now I'm quoting her words. A commission to assign jobs to future doctors sat in the dean's office. Students had no choice over their work assignments. The commission allocated them according to its own requirements. Students awaiting their fate crowded the corridor. Most were downhearted. Where would we end up? The majority of assignments were in distant corners of the country. My turn came. I went into the grand room. Behind a massive table sat the representatives of various employers. The gaze of the director of personnel of the NKVD's Gulag fell on me. She liked the fact that I was an excellent student and a young Communist League Komsomol member. I ought to be showing a good example. My classmate, Olga K., sobbed, begging not to be sent to the countryside. She got lucky. Her outburst of tears got her a job in the city of Pyatigorsk. They described my work in the godforsaken hole where I would be the only doctor in the district. I thought of A Doctor's Notebook by Vikenty Veresayev, The Medical Stories by Chekhov, and recalled my own grandfather, a country doctor under the Tsar. Romanticism welled up inside me, overwhelming my reserve. Send me as far away as possible, I loudly declared. No doubt I made an impression. The commission looked at me with surprise and fresh interest, and I was assigned to the Far East, to the Lower Amur Gulag camp. So that's the quotation, now my words. Sofia Guzikova explained her decision to go to the Gulag as a romantic desire to imitate the classic models of Russian medical intelligentsia service. Perhaps her choice was motivated by grief as well. Her fellow student, Yura, my first difficult love, as she called him, had died of an unspecified illness less than a year before graduation. She visited his grave to say farewell before departing from Moscow. Unlike prisoner doctors who did forced labor in the Gulag's medical service or who sought work in their profession while in captivity, many free civilian doctors apparently chose to work for the forced labor camp system. A few, like Jan Pulleritz, a character I introduced in the first chapter, who is a free doctor, followed patrons to the camps in the early years of Gulag construction. But these were exceptional cases. The Gulag was chronically short of skilled medical staff as it grew. It recruited freely hired doctors and other medical personnel through multifarious channels in the 1930s. By 1938, a system of graduate assignment conducted by the medical schools with oversight from the Communist Party and institutional recruiters catapulted candidates fresh from the medical school lecture hall benches to work in the Gulag's sanitary service. It was almost certainly Gulag recruiter and later deputy chief of the Central Gulag Sanitary Department, the medical service, Lyubov Chudnovskaya, whose gaze fell upon Sofia Guzikova in winter 1940. This Kiev-trained medical doctor and manager joined the Gulag in 1938. She apparently had her eye on Guzikova's good marks, her Komsomol membership, and her leadership potential. From 1938, the assignment of hundreds of jobs to graduating classes of physicians was an annual ritual in medical institutes taking several days or even weeks. Commissions chaired by representatives of the Health Commissariat and composed of school directors and party representatives, as well as recruiters from specific employers, spent much time reviewing references and academic results, hearing from party monitors, and interviewing each candidate separately, discussing 3 to 5 prospective assignments with them. Embedded medical services in the Army, the Navy, the railways, the secret police got first choice of the graduates, with the remainder going to civilian service or postgraduate academic careers. Remarkably, the Gulag and even branches of its operations like Dalstroy, the Kolyma gold mining operation, sent senior representatives to scout for talent. By the time that Guzikova was assigned to Gulag work in 1940, Chudnovskaya's recruitment machine was well-oiled, and between 1939 and 1952, it sent 5,359 new doctors to work in the camps, and most of those would have been women. Almost none of these doctors told their stories in memoirs, and the few who did explained their decision for the Gulag in romantic terms. A Magadan doctor of Guzikova's vintage, Nina Savoyeva, who boldly entitled her 1936 memoir, I Chose Kolyma, tells a similar story of her decision, and these are her words. They offered me 4 different places to choose from, one of which was Magadan. The commission told me it was a town of prisoners. I made my decision for Magadan. Do you have someone there? Asked the chairman of the commission. I am an orphan. I don't have anyone out there, I replied. I've only heard about the existence of this town for the first time here. I think I'm needed there more than anywhere else. Savoyeva was one of at least 14 Moscow Medical Institute graduates sent in 1940 to Magadan to work in Dalstroy's camp infirmaries and clinics. Why did these doctors choose the Gulag? Naive romanticism or stirring altruism may appeal in a memoir, but the official archives show that pragmatic bargaining, tears, and grandstanding were at least as prevalent in job assignment commissions as youthful romanticism. At the same time, the late 1930s was a moment when the Communist Party and state media promoted remote construction sites as exciting opportunities for youth, and there is evidence of some genuine enthusiasm for these prospects, whatever participants may have felt like in retrospect. Finally, as unlikely as it may seem, the alternatives to Gulag employment looked much less attractive to some candidates.
Thank you, Dan. I hope that gives you some flavour of how revealing and rich the testimonies are that Dan mainly uses as sources. And just sort of picking up on these 2 lives that you introduced there, Savoyeva and Guzikova, one thing that comes out not just through their stories that you tell, but through many of the stories actually, is that once these doctors are working in the Gulag medical system, that they often are have multiple kind of quarrels, confrontations with the authorities, and this seems to be a real kind of pattern that runs through a lot of their careers, and in some cases leads to their leaving the Gulag medical profession altogether if they're free to do so. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the source of some of those tensions, because they seem really to go to the heart of what Gulag medicine is about, and some of the tensions and peculiarities that are at the heart of the book, really, which is to do with really how difficult it is to conduct sort of what we might think of as kind of normal medical career and procedures, and pursue normal kind of medical ethics within the Gulag. So could you talk a little bit about what do these doctors and medical professionals do on a daily basis, and what are some of the difficulties that the Gulag setting puts in their way?
Well, the Gulag is a very peculiar setting for medical care, obviously. First of all, there's compulsory labor. And the prisoners are being worked 10, 12, 14 hours a day, sometimes longer, and they're being asked to labor in unmechanized forms of toil in construction, felling trees, in timber logging operations, and also in mines, in many sort of gold mining, nickel mining, and so on. So the work is onerous. The system devised in the 1920s and rolled out across the Gulag in the 1930s and prevailing until the death of Stalin was that he who did not work did not eat, and the more that you produced, the greater your ration. And what this meant was, if you were physically fit and strong, you might perform to the 100% of your quota and get a decent ration, although even 100% quota wouldn't actually give you enough calories to necessarily survive, but that many people fell prey to emaciation and other forms of malnourishment and starvation related diseases like tuberculosis and vitamin deficiencies, pellagra and scurvy being the main ones. Pellagra is a B vitamin deficiency. And these, they can be killers. So the dilemma facing the Gulag medical system was how to save as many of these prisoners as possible. And that was their job. That was why they were being paid. That was why the budget line was there for hospitals and clinics in the Gulag. And this was the paradox that these graduate, freely hired doctors and prisoner doctors confronted in their everyday practice. They had patients in front of them who clearly needed bed rest, food, and specialist care sometimes to bring them back from the brink of vitamin deficiency diseases, tuberculosis, and so forth. And that care wasn't always possible or available. Sometimes these doctors, the best thing that they could offer was actually bed rest and a hospital ration. And that was, it's actually quite telling that conditions for normal prisoners who weren't hospitalized in the Gulag were so bad that to be hospitalized in just a clean bed with a hospital ration to eat every day in warmth and without being exhausted by manual labor was enough to restore you. It tells you something about the ordinary conditions. And I should make this perfectly clear. 18 million people passed through the Gulag in the period from 1930 to 1953. And something like 2.5 or 3 million of those people died. Deaths that we can attribute to their time in the Gulag. 1.7 million died recorded deaths, and the rest died as a result of the abuse and the neglect, the conditions that they endured in the Gulag. the highest spike of death was during the Second World War, when 1 million prisoners died in those 4 years alone. And those are recorded deaths. Probably many more died just outside the prison gates. So these doctors confront a situation which is overwhelming and which is extreme, and which nothing in the academy, nothing in the medical institute has prepared them for at all. And the interesting thing about Savoyeva, I think, and Guzikova is that their experience does lead to this kind of conflict with commandants, with local commandants, with the local secret police inside the camps, who tell them that they simply can't release as many prisoners as they would like, issue as many sick notes to prisoners as they would like, so that they can have that bed rest and that food. There's a quota. You're only allowed to give out so many of those passes per day, and we need the rest of the prisoners to work, and it doesn't matter if they are being worked to death or not. So those are the kinds of, in general terms, those are the kinds of conditions. And in more specific terms, I'd say that what the Gulag system set up were very conventional, surprisingly conventional looking hospitals, with a surgery department, with a therapeutic department, with an X-ray laboratory, with a chemical analysis laboratory for running tests on people. All of those things, by 1945, all of the camps have a central camp hospital that has these kinds of facilities, a morgue where autopsies are performed, and lessons are learned about whether diagnosis was correct or not. So it has all of these facilities, 10,000 workers in these various kinds of facilities, and hundreds of different kinds of clinics and camps. And the paradox for the workers who find themselves in that system is, how do we do with what we have the least harm possible and the most benefit possible to the prisoner patients?
Yeah, and I think one thing that I found really striking through the book actually was the extent of the sort of strength actually of professional identity. So especially doctors who were fully trained before they came into the Gulag, because there were some who learned on the job, which is, or not on the, well, sort of on the job in the Gulags, which is another really interesting part of the book. But you know, the strength of kind of professional identity and professional ethics, and the degree to which actually mentoring was possible within the system, and mentoring to some extent in line with sort of non-Gulag medical principles, is very striking and actually quite inspiring in the book, that actually there is really quite a strong tradition that somehow perversely almost kind of lives on due to the sheer number of physicians who are trained physicians who are arrested, but who have some scope to kind of train the next generation down. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
There is a surprising sort of professional solidarity that runs across the prisoner-free worker divide in the medical system. I interviewed a Gulag doctor who worked in Kolyma. She eventually served in Magadan in the ordinary hospitals and then emigrated to Canada. And Anna she was a contract doctor. She was one of these doctors who was assigned by a graduate commission to go and work in 1948 in that area. And the thing that she was very keen to tell me was that she appreciated the mentorship of the prisoner doctors, who, generally speaking, were male, older, classically trained, very important, because the doctors who were trained up in the crash courses of the 1930s lacked a lot of experience and deeper learning about medicine. And so these older prisoner doctors became important mentors, important touchstones for these younger contract doctors in terms of giving advice and guidance on how to conduct a diagnosis, how to recognize certain diseases, how to conduct surgery, and so on. And and certainly there were many cases where there was a deep distrust between medical professionals who were prisoners or who were close to the commandants, who were contract doctors of various kinds. But there was also plenty of examples of this kind of professional solidarity. There were two kinds of power at operation inside the Gulag medical service. The first one was the conventional power that we would recognize in any medical facility. There's a hierarchy, isn't there? There's a medical manager at the top. The NHS has, a controller somewhere, probably, and and then the hospital has its managerial doctors and its doctors running specific wards and so on, and then beneath that are paramedics and nurses and so on. There's a hierarchy there. And that hierarchy operated in these institutions as well, and people understood that hierarchy and worked within that hierarchy. But that hierarchy also had to reckon with the hierarchy of the camp commandants, the camp's work assignment bureaucrats, the camp's supply manager bureaucrats, and the camp secret police, internal secret police. And so there are two forms of power in the Gulag hospital. One was the medical power, the power to save lives, and then there was what I call the sovereign power, the power to take life or to let live.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, this goes to the kind of broader question, I guess, which we started with, sort of thinking about reacting in a sense to Solzhenitsyn's view of the Gulag and to some extent to Shalamov's as well, and thinking about the Gulag medical service as a sort of grey zone. So somewhere in between, I guess, sort of complicating that binary between victims and perpetrators. And what you were saying then about the sort of different pressures that operate on the medical system is, I think, a big part of that story. Do you think that the medical service is a grey zone? Did you end up sort of concluding that? I mean, is this part of this broader sort of arena which went far beyond medical roles? Obviously, other sort of so-called trustee roles for prisoners, where they were to some extent complicit with the administration or sort of part of the administration, but also clearly had other identities within the camps as well. Did your research kind of shift that model or sort of confirm that model of this kind of in-between zone?
I would say that the gray zone model works very well for explaining some issues in the puzzle of Gulag medicine. Because you have that glue of professional solidarity that works across the prisoner free worker divide, you need some kind of explanation for that. And the idea of a gray zone where people are working within a system that has to run, that they are accountable for in some way or other, makes sense. Also, the fact that even the prisoners within this gray zone are living more privileged lives than ordinary prisoners. They're better housed, they're better fed, they're better clothed as a rule, and they are obviously working to a different rhythm, although they work to quite high and demanding quotas compared to civilian medicine. So the gray zone concept does help, but sometimes it's just so peculiar that I think the gray zone isn't
cover
an
it.
adequate.
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
an adequate explanation.
Yeah.
I'm thinking particularly of the morgue.
Yes, which I wanted to talk to you about the morgue, which sounds like a terribly gloomy opening sentence, but I was very struck by of all the lives who you explore. You know, that they're all so different and so complex. But I did feel that your character, the person who works in the morgue, who you trace most, who's Yevgenia Kersnovskaya, this amazing, she's an amazing Gulag writer in her own right, quite recently kind of really discovered and sort of properly published in Russia, and now I think also in translation. But she worked in the morgue, and there actually, again, it becomes this sort of place of where these tensions are working themselves out, that on the one hand there's a kind of dignity that she feels that she can try and preserve in the treatment of the dead, but at the same time it really exposes her to the cruelty and the abjection of the Gulag. That's really where this sort of almost grotesque, sort of almost absurd sort of quality to some aspects of Gulag medicine really came out very strongly. I can't remember the quotation now about the morgue being the most... What's the quotation of the morgue being the most sort of jolly place or something in the Gulag?
No, it's even more. It's even more upbeat than that. It's the place where death delights in helping life.
Oh yes.
So this is the Latin quotation over the portal to the morgue at the Sorbonne, and Kersnovskaya quotes it in her memoirs because she's told. When she's confronted with the offer of a job in the morgue that she finds revolting, that in fact she will be doing some form of good because she'll be revealing the truth about prisoners' deaths as she conducts autopsies. She has, Kersnovskaya is from Moldova. She was picked up in the deportations when the Soviet Union overran Moldova in the Second World War, and eventually ends up in Norilsk. She has veterinary training, and she learns how to conduct autopsies. She conducts over, I think, 1,200 autopsies in a very short period in the morgue. Why does the Gulag have a morgue in its central hospitals? At this point in 20th century medicine, we don't have CT scanners, we don't have very sophisticated X-ray equipment, we have very poor technical methods for confirming diagnoses. And so the autopsy in the hospital was a really important ritual which helped medical administrators and doctors to understand what had the course of a disease and what had happened in a particular patient's illness leading to their death. If a patient died in hospital, Soviet conventions dictated that they should be autopsied. So that was her role. And she discovered that the morgue was also a place where many of these mentors found refuge, and where educators trained the next generation of paramedics and nurses in particular, using the opportunity of an anatomy lesson every day to begin to introduce prisoner students quite often to the principles of medicine in the clinical setting and in the morgue.
Yeah. Just one maybe last question before we open up for Q&A, which is thinking about the last sort of section of the book, where you consider in particular the questions of what kind of research could take place. So you've talked a lot about the sort of challenges of simply looking after patients. The system was quite well resourced in some ways, but they were up against huge challenges in terms of the physical condition of the patients and in terms of these kind of dual pressures on sort of medical work itself. But in the last two chapters, you turn to the kind of research that was actually also going on in the Gulag. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about this. So this is research into sort of malingering and the sort of psychology of malingering, and this extraordinary story that the last chapter covers of this sort of radiation research, essentially. And I was very interested by this because, again, this is a sort of much more complicated story than we might imagine, that there is, to a degree, certain sorts of research that actually can only really happen in the Gulag because of the particular conditions and the particular things that are possible there.
Thank you. I think that it would be very difficult for me to describe both of those cases succinctly. But let me start with the Malingering case. So I focus on the life of this particular psychiatrist who worked in the Gulag, Lev Sokolovsky, who was arrested, was sent to Ukhta, and who worked as the chief of the psychiatric ward of the Central Camp Hospital. In the 1940s, the Ukhta medical establishment had frequent conferences and presented papers based on the illnesses that they observed and the conditions that they felt that they could do something about. Mostly vitamin deficiencies attracted a lot of attention in this research. And there's a body of research, papers unpublished, that sit in the central archives of the Gulag administration, where I first discovered Sokolovsky's work. Sokolovsky's paper is extremely different, a standout piece of work about mental health issues in the Gulag. And it is about the apparent faking of illnesses. And he has treated 400 plus patients for severe mental illness in his ward in the previous 2 or 3 years, and he writes a research paper, handwrites a research paper of several pages, which he presents to a conference in Ukhta, and then it gets sent on to Moscow, to the archives of the Gulag. And he discusses the ways in which medical conditions, prisoners' living conditions actually impinge on their mental health and drive some of them so mad that they're capable of presenting with mental illness even though they are not mentally ill per se. He talks about the problem that commandants think that every mental patient in the Gulag is faking, and he argues very robustly against that and says possibly 1, 2, 3%, but not more than that. The people I see in front of me are genuine cases. But at the same time, memoirists and other observers of Sokolovsky and his work talk about the fact that he sometimes also assisted people by coaching them on how to present a mental illness in order to escape hard labor, in order to perhaps gain some of that precious bed rest in a Gulag hospital. So that's one case of an unusual research paper that I decided to turn into a chapter based on this very interesting psychiatrist. The second is
Shall we? I'm thinking it is such a complicated and bizarre story that perhaps we should park it for now and see if we can fit it in later, because it really is an interesting note on which to end, and it really does bring out kind of this bizarre scope for sort of certain types of very creative research to be carried out in this setting where we might least expect it. In any case, the floor is open to questions, comments.
Thank you for a most interesting lecture. You have not mentioned the medical services that were present for the guards, the authorities. Were they medically checked by the same people, or did they have their own medical service?
Yes, they had the same medical service, in fact, and they sometimes had separate wards or separate institutions. Once a Gulag camp had developed to the stage where it was becoming a town, effectively, then quite often there was a separation between the services facilities offered to the prisoners and those offered to guards, commandants, bureaucrats, free settlers in a particular town like Magadan or Ukhta. And yet, at the same time, the free employees routinely sought out prisoner doctors because, again, they were older often, they were more experienced. They weren't these greenhorn young ladies from Moscow Medical Institute, but they were professors from Leningrad Military Medical Academy and so on. So they were the creme de creme. And so it was not unusual for commandants, their wives, to be treated by prisoner doctors by choice rather than going to the freely hired contract doctors. And the other thing is, I would say, is just that there was a lot of traffic back and forth between those two sets of patients and those two sets of doctors in terms of the facilities where they worked in. Often it was just a separate room that was designated for the guards or what have you. Thank you.
That was very interesting. Were the gulags regarded in any way as research laboratories?
In the way that we think of Nazi concentration camps and death camps, one can't observe that in the available documentation. What one does observe are commandants who recognize that they have professors from Leningrad and Moscow, from the academies and so on, as prisoners in their purview. And they set up research laboratories for them in some of the most urbanized and most sophisticated, most developed camps, particularly in the 1940s and 1950s. And so what you see there are an extensive range of projects. I hesitate to call them experiments because I don't want to give them the same kind of label that we're used to thinking about in the Nazi case. But there are projects to try different nutritional substances, to manufacture different kinds of vitamin supplements and so on in order to improve nutrition and general physical well-being of cohorts of prisoners. So you get groups of prisoners who are fed on different kinds of yeast products or products based on lichen or other sort of naturally occurring plants that are found in the local environment. And so there are nutrition-based experiments, if you like. There's also labor therapy experiments. Labor therapy is something that's common across the industrialized world in the early 20th century as a panacea for tuberculosis patients and other kinds of sufferers of different illnesses. And so this is also attempted in the camps in various ways, and quite often it's just transparently trying to get labor out of people who are enjoying bed rest and better. They were involuntary guinea pigs, exactly. The case of the radioactivity study that ends the book is actually a radium water source near Ukhta, where experiments are conducted on both prisoner and free citizens in radium water bathing. So this was a therapeutic technique that was widespread across Europe, Central and Eastern Europe in particular, in the early 20th century, and the Gulag discovered it had a source of radium water near Ukhta that was particularly rich, and at least 1,500 people were subjected to various forms of bathing experiments to see whether it would cure a whole range of different illnesses. And we don't know what happens to those individual people, but the doctor around whom I frame the story in that chapter observes many cases of radiation sickness by the 1950s and remembers specific patients very vividly as victims of the kind of neglect, but also the medical ignorance of those early experiments. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This was incredibly interesting. I was wondering what the reproductive and like antenatal care was like in the Gulag, because at least in prisons now there are like women pregnant, giving birth, and I know that like there was a Soviet practice of having like kindergartens included in the prison system, especially in the Gulag. So like how was that? Was there like a separate gynecologist on site? I assume it was also really bad conditions, but yeah.
So I wasn't able to actually include a chapter on the children's homes in the Gulag. And the reason for that was that I didn't have adequate memoir material. I didn't have a biography around which I could organize this. I started writing a chapter focusing on Eugenia Ginsburg, who is a self-taught nurse who writes very vividly, but alas, rather briefly, about her experience of working in those children's homes. So the children's homes that the Gulag paid for and sponsored and had within the barbed wire were to look after the infants of female prisoners. Female prisoners gave birth in the camps, and those babies were free Soviet citizens who were entitled to a joyous childhood, like every Stalinist child. And I wanted to write about the experience of medical workers in that setting, but I lacked sufficient material to do that. However, what I do write about briefly in one of the chapters about apprenticeships in the Gulag is the training of natal nurses for care for prisoner mothers and their infants in the Gulag. The infants' homes in the Gulag had appallingly high death rates. Negligence was widespread, and the care was very poor indeed. So that may be one reason why we have no coherent memoirs about that. A different kind of account would need to be written that would be more of a classic historical account. But thank you for that question.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. Did you get a sense from the sources that you focused on of how these Gulag doctors kind of found their experience, or at least how they recalled it? I'm sure it kind of varies on a case-by-case basis, but say you mentioned the woman who worked in the morgue carrying out autopsies, and how maybe she was able to overcome the kind of dilemma of working for this system by the fact that she was able to carry out or kind of achieve some kind of good outcome. Was that a kind of theme that crops up, that doctors felt like they were able to kind of, I don't know, sort of justify it morally by the fact that they were saving lives, or at least kind of improving lives in some way?
It's a good question, and one that takes me back to my earliest days of this project. When I started to read the accounts of doctors, I believed everything they said, because one wants to believe one's doctor. And I had never thought, of course I had thought critically about medicine in a historical context, but I had never thought about not trusting the word of doctors. So one of the things that I had to train myself to do, I think, and this is part of how you read memoirs anyway, is to ask questions about the veracity of this account, to ask questions about what is this person shielding themselves from in this account? What are the things that they're not willing to discuss. And so for each memoirist, at some point, I go to room 101. I ask of that memoirist, I think, what did you think of the mass death that you saw in these places? What did you think of the mass illness that could have been prevented that you saw in these places? And we get varying answers, of course. As you say, the accounts are very different. And some of the variation relies on, in part, whether the doctor was a prisoner doctor and feels strongly about this and can talk about injustice directly, fully, or whether they're a contract doctor who worked for the NKVD, who signed a non-disclosure agreement with the NKVD, and who feels they actually have to be careful about how they disclose what they saw and how they felt about it, because of the moral issues involved. The discomfort that they're still feeling in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1980s, writing about this or talking about it to a relative who's taking it down. So those are, that's how I approach this question. And what I found was that different doctors and different medical practitioners had different approaches to this question of the atrocities that they saw, or just simply the atrocious conditions that they saw. Some shielded themselves from any direct responsibility for it. Many of the younger doctors are able to say, well, I was just green. I didn't know that I was entering this kind of mad system, this paradoxical system that was both working people to death and saving them at the same time. And so I wasn't responsible for that, but I simply did what I could do within the context I was in. So I leave it to the reader to decide what that makes of the Gulag Doctor as a moral character. I think it's an open question in every case, and I fall back on the words of Solzhenitsyn, who talks about good and evil in every human soul, in every human heart, that there is no purely good person, there is no purely evil person, but there are measures of good and evil in every human heart.
Thank you very much. And the question is like evaluation of the previous one on that. As far as I know, the Shalamov portrayed doctors as protectors of prisoners in terms of the NKVD were trusting the criminal elements, not the 58th article elements, and the doctors were trying to save everyone. So do we have any evidence of how NKVD side viewed this? Did they see doctors as someone who needed like extra control, extra attention because they don't understand how it should work, or they were less severe in their relation?
The NKVD needed doctors. So their job, the NKVD, the Gulags' purpose, we could say, was the colonization of these so-called empty spaces and the building of these industries and the building of canals and so on. So to do that, they needed prisoner labor. If prisoner labor died egregiously, died too much, if I can put it like that, then there was a problem and it would be reported back to Moscow. And so the NKVD took a light touch to doctors who misbehaved, I would say. It's actually a fact that a higher percentage of qualified doctors worked in their profession as prisoners than prisoner engineers or prisoner technicians of other kinds. A higher percentage were brought into their field of occupational field than technicians who might have helped to build more railways or more canals and more bridges and so on. So the NKVD indulged doctors to some extent and indulged medical workers to some extent because they needed prisoner lives to perform labor.
Mentioned the conflict between Sokolovsky and the commandant, where he said that your opinion on fake mental are not true. Do we see any result of these conflicts? What was the moderation?
Well, there's a high degree or an interesting degree of what's called medical tufta going on in the system. So tufta is normally a term in Gulag slang that refers to faked labor output results. So we've produced so much timber, we've produced so many miles of railway track, etc., etc. And prisoners and guards and work assignment officers all colluded in generating false reports that were sent on to Moscow of successful quotas filled and commodities produced. Medical tufta also existed, so false diagnoses, the coaching of a favored prisoner patient to produce symptoms that would enable a doctor to hospitalize that patient so they could save that patient from hard labor. Other things like faking, in one case in my book, faking a diagnosis for a horse in a veterinary station so that the opiates that were needed by humans could be taken from the veterinary station and handed over to the hospital doctor for his human patients instead. So even a horse could get a fake diagnosis in the Gulag. That's how absurd the system was.
I'm just going to ask one more question, if that's all right. Is that okay? If I'm not exhausting you too much. So right at the beginning, I asked you to kind of think back to the roots of this this project and how you ended up writing this book. I wonder, in another sort of longue durée sort of reflection, how did this book change your view of Soviet history more broadly? So throughout the book, you talk about certain sort of crossovers between sort of Gulag and non-Gulag spaces and practices, and that these aren't entirely worlds apart, which is something that a lot of Gulag historians are now concentrating on. But what did it kind of teach you about Soviet history, looking at these doctors, looking at this medical system that you hadn't sort of seen before, because you've been looking at Soviet history for a very long time? What in a broader sense do you think it can tell us?
I think what I'm very pleased with in this book actually is the story of Soviet medicine that it tells more broadly. In English, there really isn't a proper history of Soviet medicine. There's really no adequate, up-to-date account of Soviet medicine and Soviet medical practice and the organization of Soviet medicine. We're reliant still in English on accounts that are 40, 50, sometimes 60 years old, and that aren't based on new archival evidence and are not informed by critical medical studies, I would say. So that's studies that stand outside of medicine and away from the hierarchy and the hagiography of conventional medical history, and ask critical questions about gender, about class, about nation, about all kinds of issues and decisions that are political ultimately. So what I feel I ended up having to do in almost every chapter is tell a little story of the history of Soviet medicine in order to put my Gulag doctors and their medicine in the broader context, and to help the reader understand the traffic between the Gulag and the non-Gulag in the Soviet system. And I think perhaps that's also illuminated more widely. It's a concept that historians of the Gulag have been talking about for over 10 years now, Gulag and the non-Gulag and the porosity of the penal system. But I think we see in this book a good example of how that actually worked and didn't work. and what the limits of that kind of traffic across the barbed wire was.
And if I just may ask one more question about sort of the post-Soviet aspect, which is one thing we haven't really talked about, but which I think is apparent in the kind of sources that you've been discussing all the way through, is the issue of memory, not just personal memory, but also the way in which these stories in particular, and the sort of pride in the medical history and certain of these people becoming kind of local celebrities in a sense, has actually shaped the identity of these places to a very significant degree. And I wonder if you could talk about how that, how you think that continues to affect the way not just the Gulag is remembered, but how these places' identities continues to evolve in the present day.
It's a wonderful question, and I could talk about it for quite a long time. But to sum it up, I would say that I was very struck when I first went to these Gulag towns, the degree to which the medical history of these towns was celebrated and held up as a kind of model of the building of these towns. The historians in towns that were built by prisoner labor had to work with that material, had to work with that past. It's very easy to sit in Moscow and shake your fist at Stalin and shake your fist at the Gulag and say, oh, you ruined the intelligentsia. It's very different to be a historian in Magadan or in Ukhta or Pechora or Norilsk and ask questions about the origin of your town and explain that to the school children in your town in a way that's palatable. I think the Australians probably have had to do this as well. But if your town was built by prisoners, then somehow you have to imagine a way of presenting that in your local museums, in schools, and in educational work. And what struck me very much was that, to some extent, medical protagonists, prisoners and free employees, stood out as moral exemplars and as people whose work was obviously constructive in a way that the engineers who built railways to nowhere or canals that were too shallow to use or whatever weren't necessarily obvious exemplars. But the medical services did something that appeared to be unalloyed and positive. And in that sense, I was very struck by that when I went to those towns, and that was part of the critical filter I think I brought to the memoirs as well, was looking at them through that very particular lens of local historians, local heroes.
Thank you so much. So I think, oh yes, sorry.
So sort of similar to what Polly was asking, but a broader question about archival access to do with the Gulag. So obviously you accessed the archives, you went to museums all around Russia. What do you think is happening with Gulag testimonies and archives under the current regime? And how is the access changing? And how is the approach of the authorities to Gulag history changing?
These are very good questions and very sobering questions. The research that I did took place years ago. I started in 2007, and my research trips to Gulag cities took place in 2009 to 2010, 11. So quite a long time ago. The situation has obviously worsened with the closure of Memorial, with the declaration of the Sakharov Foundation as an undesirable organization, with all of the attacks that are going on in Russia today against civil society's attempts to commemorate the victims of Stalinism and the victims of state repression and violence in Russia. So that's a grave concern. the archives that I used at Memorial in Moscow and St. Petersburg no longer accessible. The opportunity for a Western researcher to go to these remote regions and collaborate with museum curators and local historians, that's virtually shuttered now. That's virtually impossible now. Very few Western researchers are able to go to the West. It may be that some of the state archives are still open and operating, certainly for Russian historians and for favored foreigners, but in the West we have our own perspective on what it means to cooperate with the Russians now, and that would stop most researchers, I think, from going to work in the archives before they even thought about whether it was possible or not. One of the paradoxes of Russia is that the archives of the official Gulag administration were opened in the 1990s and early 2000s. And to the best of my knowledge, they remain open to legitimate researchers who go to the state archives of the Russian Federation. But the richer work of going to popular archives or the richer work of using civil society archives, that's been destroyed by this war. Wars destroy things, and that's what this war has destroyed.
Has there been any sort of digitization of any of the archives, or is it very much you have to go there and look at things in person?
It depends on the archive, and it's very varied. I have to say one thing. This book was principally written between 2020 and last year, and the digitization of civil society archives really helped me a lot. I was able to find various snippets of information, confirm various things, find memoirs and so on from inaccessible regions. Norilsk is not that easy to go to. And the digital world really does make a huge difference where all that's concerned. But again, of course, it's under threat. And some facilities, like the Sakharov database of Gulag survivor memoirs, for example, invaluable. And it is endangered because of the way that the Sakharov Foundation has been treated by the Russian state.
Okay, well, I think we probably can finish up there unless there's anything you'd like to add, Dan, but otherwise I'd just like to thank Dan so much for this wonderful book, which I heartily recommend to any of you who haven't yet read it, and I hope this has whetted your appetite to read it, and thank you so much for a fascinating discussion, Dan. It's been really wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.